Hey, I'm Hunter from SkillThrive, and welcome to the third lesson in this 4-part course where you'll design and code a video channel landing page. In this lesson, you'll write the CSS for the HTML from lesson 2. Once you're done, you'll move on to implementing VinoBox, a responsive jQuery Lightbox plugin for the videos. You'll also find all the lessons linked for this course in the description. Feel free to follow along and write the code as we go, but you can also download the final code and design on skillthrive.com for a small price. This helps me as a creator to continue making design and development courses for you to watch at no cost. With that out of the way, let's get started. So the first thing we want to do in our style.css folder is to go ahead and just import the Google fonts. And to do that, I'm going to head to fonts.google.com. And up here, I'm going to search for the font I want, which is Open Sans. And then click here on this little plus, and it's going to add it down here in this section. And when you can click here and expand that, I can come into Customize and select the weights that I want in the style. So I want regular 400 and I want bold 700. So let's go ahead and select that. And then I'm going to come back to Embed, and then at import, and just copy this at import that's in between these two style tags. And then once you copy that, just head back into your styles and then paste that in there. And after you paste that in, you're able to use that here in the CSS. All right, so now let's go ahead and just close the Google Fonts. And the first thing I'm going to do is just set some global styles or styles that are going to be applied to everything. And the first one is box sizing is going to be set to border box. Now, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about what this is. There's some videos and some articles that I'll link to in the helpful links in the description or in the course files that go into more detail. But essentially, what this allows us to do is make sure that whenever we set a width on something, it's going to stay that width, which might sound obvious, like wouldn't that kind of be the way it works? Well, not really. Let's say, for instance, we set a width on something to be 400 pixels. Well, if we added padding to that, the padding would actually be added on the outside of that. So if it was a 400 pixel container, and then we added 20 on the left and the right, it would actually kind of be acting as a 440 pixel container. So that's really not the behavior that we really want. We want that padding to be added on the inside. So if we added a 400 pixel div and then 20 pixels of padding, it's going to be added to the inside and then applied to whatever's inside that container. All right, so that's kind of what box sizing does. If you want to dive into that a little bit more, check out the links. I'll make sure, like I said, to tag that in case you want to have a deeper dive. So the next thing you want to do is adjust the padding. Now, if you come into our current project here and I just come in and inspect this, you'll see that, H1 has a default margin, so does the P tags, and so does the button. You can see that has a little bit of padding there. Now, this is fine, but really we want to get rid of all that and then add the padding ourselves. And that just gives us more control in making sure that we're not accidentally missing something, or there's a little bit of padding that we missed and then it's just adding onto our style, and it just kind of levels the playing field a little bit. So to do that, all you have to do is type in padding and then set that to 0. And then you can set margin to 0 as well. And once I save that, you'll see everything kind of gets scooted up right next to each other because the margin and paddings are set to 0. Next up, we're going to apply a style to the body. Now, before I do this, I actually want to create some CSS variables. I'm going to do that up here. Now, if you're not familiar with CSS variables, they're essentially just stored values that we're going to use over and over again in our styles. And why that's important, let's say, for instance, we have that green color. We're going to, like an accent color that we're going to use throughout the project. Well, we could write that every single time, or we could just store that value in one place and just refer to it in the name of the variable. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to do the root pseudo class, and that's going to allow us to use these variables throughout our CSS. And then once you do this, you can go ahead and write the name like this. So dash dash and then the name, and I'm going to do accent. And then I'm going to set it to a hex code. Now I'm going to go back to Figma here into this button and then into this rectangle, and then I'm going to copy this hex code. Then I'm going to head back to our code and put in that value right here. And now what I can do is I can refer to this variable name accent and then and wherever I want. But and why that's really cool too. So let's imagine I want to change that color. So instead of going through and changing every instance of it, I can just go to this one variable, change it, and then all of the places I use this variable name will be changed. All right, so there's a couple more here I want to do. The next one is going to be a variable named dark. And then let's go back into the Figma file. And on this artboard, I have that color here. And then we can just go ahead and paste that in. And the next one's going to be light. And that, I actually remember what that one is. It's just F4, like that. And the next one is going to be an overlay. In the overlay, I'm actually going to be using an RGBA. Now, I'm going to be using this dark color, but this dark color has a hex code, but it also has an RGB value. And we can see that right there. It's 23, 25, 29. And we can use that with RGBA, A being the alpha or the transparency, in order to drop that overall transparency. Now, you can't really do that with a hex code, but with RGBA, you can. So we'll type in RGBA, and that was 23, 25, 29, and then you have your alpha value. Now your alpha value for completely, you want 100% opacity would be 1, and then you can set that to like smaller units. So 0.8 would be 80% opacity, and that's what we want this to be set to. And the next thing is the ease. So let's go ahead and name that variable, and this is just going to be a transition setting that we're going to be using throughout this, and this is going to allow when things change, for instance, on a hover, it's going to allow a nice smooth motion instead of it just happening instantly. And on that, we want to type all. And we want this, and the reason we type all is it's going to be applied to all the changes that are making. So if we change the color, or if we want to change the border or whatever, it's going to be applied to all of those styles that we actually change in a pseudo class like hover. And that'll make some more sense here in just a second. But let's go ahead and just type this out. And the next one we're going to do is 0.3 seconds. And this is how long the transition is going to last. And then ease is the motion, or the kind of like the speed, right? So if you go back to like physics class, you remember like a linear motion has a constant acceleration, and then ease kind of has like it eases into it. It has a little more of a kinetic motion. It just feels nicer. So it's definitely something that I think you should want to do in your transitions, because it just brings a little more liveliness to it. All right, the next one is 0 seconds. So that is a 0 second delay. And that's everything for our actual variable. So let's actually use one of those variables down here in the body. And to do that, you actually just target the background color. And to use the variable, we do var, open and close parentheses, and then the name of the variable. So dark, or dash dark. And then once we save that, you can see the background here has changed to that dark variable. All right, so the next thing we want to do is just some styles here for the P tag, the button, H1 and H4. And that's going to be color. It's going to be set to the variable of light. So once we save that, you can see that change take place. And then we can target just the P and H1. And on this one, we want to set the font family. So this is going to be font family. And the font family is going to be Open Sans, which is what we called up above when we imported the Google font. And then the fallback is just sans serif. So if for whatever reason Open Sans doesn't load, or if this isn't an older browser, you'll be able to just use the default sans serif that comes in the browser. And then last is the font weight. And that's going to be 400, which is the size for the regular size font. All right, and then next up, after that, we're going to do the H1 tag and also a button styling. And that's going to be the font family of Open Sans as well. Fallback sans serif. And on this one, we want the font weight to be 700, which is the bold font. And we also want the text decoration to be, all uppercase, which is what we did in Figma, right? So if we go back to Figma, just as a quick recap, you can see here on this text that if we went into the advanced options that we had to transform to uppercase. And we're going to do the same thing here in the code. So we need to do text, transform, uppercase. So now we save that, you'll see the section title, and you should have seen the section title change, and that's because it should be H4, not H1. So let's save that. There you go. Now you can see the section title is uppercase, and the button, it's hard to see, but the button is uppercase as well. All right, next up is the H1 tag stylings. So to do that, or the changes we want to do here is setting the font size. So font size, 48 pixels. And the margin bottom is going to be set to 20 pixels. And this size is just coming right from Figma, right? So if we go back to Figma and into our title here, you can see the size is 48. And I think the spacing here is only 15, but that spacing is added from the bottom of this text layer instead of the bottom of the baseline of the text. So I just added 5 more pixels there to kind of give it a little bit more spacing. All right, so that wraps up the heading, or excuse me, the H1. Next up, I think, is just going to be a P tag styling and an H4 styling. And on that, we want to set the font size, and that font size is going to be 18 pixels. So 18 pixels. And again, this is just coming right from our Figma design. And next up, we want to do some button styling. And here we want the cursor to be on pointer. So what that means is if I hover over the button right now, it's just this default cursor. It doesn't change to that little pointer cursor, which signifies that, hey, this is something you can actually click on. So adding this just helps kind of make that clear that this is something you can click on. And to do that, you just do cursor, pointer. And if we save that, and now if we hover over the button, you can see that cursor changes to the pointer. And the last thing we want to do here for the button is to use that transition variable. So transition var and then ease. And then we can go ahead and set what we want the button to be when we hover over it. So button pseudo class hover, and that's going to be transform. We'll do scale, and the scale is just going to be a little bit. So 1.02. And then let's go ahead and save that. And now once we hover over the button, it's hard to see, but it scales up a little bit. And it's also not like, it doesn't happen instantly, and that's because we set this transition value. It has a little bit of a delay and a little bit of a, it takes 3 seconds to complete that, and it has that nice ease motion. This will be more apparent when we come down to the video, so I'll be sure to touch base back on this transition so it's very clear what that is doing. All right, so button hover is done. The next thing we want to start working on is the wrapper. So we'll come down to wrapper. Let's see if I can actually spell it. There we go. And on here, we're going to be using grid. So to actually, use grid, you have to say that you want to use it. So display grid. And if you don't know this, display grid, what it does is that it allows you to create a grid on your site and then tell different objects where to fit within that grid. And it kind of seems a little more complicated than what it really is. And I think the reason is because there's so many different properties and values that you can pass in and do different things. But trust me, like display grid has changed the game for this. Like in the past, in order to quickly create some, responsive things like this, you would have to use something like Bootstrap. And it was just kind of a pain in the butt. But now it's a lot easier with things like grid and Flexbox. So the first thing we want to do is say like how big of the grid we want. And to do that, I'm going to create a column first. So this is going to be grid template columns. And then we have this really cool value here called an FR, or a fraction unit. And why this is useful is that it looks at the available space and kind of just does the math for us. Now, let's say, for instance, we wanted a 2-column layout, and we wanted the 2 columns to be the same size. So what we would do is we do 1 FR, then 1 FR, and then now if we save that, you can see that we have now 2 equal size sections. Now let's say, for instance, we wanted 3 columns. Well, then we could do 1 FR, 1 FR, 1 FR, so 3 of those, and now we have 3 columns. And you can start to kind of see how where it's starting to get the name of grid. Now let's say, for instance, we wanted 2 columns, but the second one we wanted twice as big as the first one. So we could do 1 FR and then 2 FR. And then you can see that second column is twice as big as the first one. So in our case, we want the full width of whatever's available. So we'll just do 1 FR. And the next thing we want to do in our wrapper is the grid template areas. Now, this is a way for you to kind of lay out the grid based off of names of different sections of your HTML. So in order to do that, though, you have to actually set the grid area to whatever it is the children of that, the wrapper is. So if we come back into our HTML, the children of this wrapper is the top section and then the content section. So we need to go ahead and define those areas here with a name. So to do that, we'll go ahead and just do top section. And then we'll write the grid area and give that grid area a name of I like to just do the name of whatever the class is. So top section. So it's very clear what it is. And the next one is going to be content section. So we'll just go ahead and write the class for this as well. So content section. And this is going to have a grid area of content section. And now we can define, how much space this should take up. So to do that, we'll come back into our wrapper and do grid template areas. And then in quotes, we'll define the names here. So on the top, the first row, we want a full width top section. Okay, so you can see that now is a full width. And on the second row, we want a full width content section. So content section. And now you can see that content section takes up the full width on the second row. All right, so that basically wraps up everything for the wrapper and then laying out the top and content section. The next thing we want to move to is styling the top section. So with that said, we'll come down to the top section here. And the first thing I'm going to do is set the height. And I'm going to use min height. So let's do min height. And then we're going to set that to 370 pixels. And again, this is just coming right from Figma. So if we come into Figma, you can see here in our design on this header, we zoom out, it'll be a little easier to see. We set this to be 370 pixels high. Now, why am I using min height? Well, min height ensures that it never gets below 370 pixels. But let's say, for instance, you had a longer description tag and this is on mobile, so it's going to take up a little bit more space. Well, setting the min height says, hey, don't go below 370, but if you need to get a little bigger in order to fit the content, feel free to do that. So that's why we're using min height instead of just setting the height, because we want that flexibility in case it needs it. So let's go ahead and just minimize Figma. And after we set the min height, the next thing we want to do is actually use grid here within the top section. So I'll do display grid. And then we need to define the grid columns. So we'll do grid template columns. And here we want to have 10% on the left, so kind of like a 10% padding on the left side. Then we want 10% on the right. And in the middle, we want to just take up the remainder space. So we'll do 1 FR. So we'll save that. And you can see how that's working right now. We haven't really defined how this should be laid out. That's why it looks a little weird. But now that we did that, we can actually define how it should be laid out with the grid template areas. So we'll do grid template areas. And like before, we have to actually define these areas. And the one that we need to define here, so if we come into the top section, is the child of header. So we'll come back and type in header. And let's go ahead and give this area a name. So grid area is just going to be called header. And then on this template, we can do the quotes again. And now we have 3 columns, right? We have one that's 10%, the right one's 10%, and in the middle is just the remaining space. Now, let's say, for instance, on the left side, we just want to have some white space. Well, we can actually define that here with just a period. So by doing that, we're saying, hey, on the left side, we don't want anything but just white space. Then in the middle, we want the header. And then on the right, we just want that 10% white space. So if we save that, you can see now that we have that 10% on the left, the 10% on the right, and then this section here just takes up the remainder of the space. So now with that done, we can come in and set the background overlay. And to do that, I'm just going to type in background. And then we're going to create a linear gradient. And this linear gradient is just, if you don't know what a gradient is, it's just kind of, you set one color here at this point, and then at the next color, you set another point, and then it kind of transitions in between those two colors. And you do this by setting to values. Now, we actually want our values to be the same because we don't want it to transition to a different color. And those actual values we're going to use from the variables that we set above. And the first one is going to be the overlay. So we'll just type variable overlay. And the second color is going to be the same thing. So variable dash dash overlay. And then we can set the URL for the background image. And to do that, we'll do URL. We'll do images / image -17 and then JPEG. And then we can save that. And now you can see the background image, and it has that nice dark overlay on it, so it kind of makes sure that the text is readable. Now obviously the sizing of that image doesn't look right, so we can go ahead and fix that with a couple properties here. So background size, we want to cover, which means like stretch this image in order to fit the entire container. So there you go, you can see how that did that. And let's go ahead and just set background position to center, which is going to center the image. And then we'll do background repeat to no repeat. And this is going to make sure that this image isn't tiled, it isn't repeated. We just want to use that one image and then make sure that it fills the entire spot. All right, so now that the top section is done, we can go ahead and add some stylings here to the header. And on the header, I'm actually going to be using Flexbox. So we'll do display flex. And by default, it's kind of, breaks it out from columns left to right automatically, given the space it's in. But you can change that by doing flex direction and then setting that to column. So now it's going to be up and down. And now you can see also that this is, because we haven't defined a size here for the button or anything else, it's just going to take up the remainder of the space. So we have to come through later and actually set those values. But the next thing we want to do is a style here called justify content. And what this is going to allow us to do is pass in an actual value here called center. And that's going to center this entire header within the top section. So you can see with just a couple of lines, you're able to kind of style that up really quickly. All right, so now with the header done, we can come in and target the some styles here in the header. The first one being the P tag. And on this, we want to set the max width to 570 pixels. And again, this is coming right from Figma, so let's jump in and just show you that. So here on this subtext, you can see that the width is 570, and we want to carry that style over to our code as well. All right, and the next thing we want to do is just give this a little bit of a margin bottom. So margin bottom is 30 pixels, and that's everything for the P tag. Then we want to do header button. We'll give this a width of 131, whoops, I spelled width wrong, of 131 pixels. Again, this is just coming right from our design. We can give this a little bit of a padding. So let's do 12 pixels on the top and 0 on the left and right. Then we want to set the background color to the accent variable. So background color var, and then we'll pass in that var of accent. And then we want to get rid of that white border. So to do that, we just do border none. All right, so now we can go ahead and move on to the next part, which is going to be the content section. So I'm just going to scroll down here to what we've already written and just add to it. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use display grid. So just do display grid. And then we want to define our grid template column. So let's do grid template columns. And here we just want to copy the same thing that we did for the header. So that's going to be 10%, 1 FR, and then 10%. And then what we want to do is the grid template areas. So grid template areas. And then we need to go ahead and define that. Now, if we come into the content section, the children that we need to define here is playlist 1 and then playlist 2. So let's go ahead and just do that here. So we'll do playlist 1, and that's going to have a grid area called playlist 1. And then we can go ahead and just copy this, paste that below, and do playlist 2, and that's going to have a name of playlist 2. Cool, and now we can actually define that up here. So that's going to be quote, empty space, playlist 1, empty space, playlist 2, and then empty space. So if we save that, we can see now that we have that left and right padding just like we do up here. So everything's going to be lined perfectly. And then we can also see the playlist is just going to take up the remaining of the space. Now the last thing I'm going to do is just add a little bit of margin to this. Let's do margin bottom of 60 pixels. So whoops, it looks like I got a typo here. There we go. And this is just going to add a little bit of margin down here. Once we style these and they fit in, we're going to have a little of some spacing down here so it's not touching the bottom of the web page. That's what that margin bottom is doing. All right, so now that we did that, we don't need to do any styling for playlist 1 or 2, but we do have the playlist title that we need to style. So playlist title. And this is just going to have a little bit of a margin to it. So let's do margin 30 pixels on the top and bottom, and then 0 on the left and right. So now you can see this playlist title has a little bit of spacing to it. All right, so next up, we want to actually design or style the videos. So we'll do videos. We're going to use grid again, so display grid. And then we're going to set the grid template columns. And here we're going to do something a little different. We're going to use a variable called, or a function called repeat. What this is going to do is we can say, let's say for instance, we wanted 12 columns. We wanted them to all be equal sizes. Well, we could do 12 1FRs all the way across, or we could do this, which is a shorthand way of writing it. So we could say repeat this 12 times with the value of 1FR. So where is this coming from? This is coming just from the styles here in our Figma. So remember that layout that we created, these 12 little blue lines? That's essentially what we're doing right now. We're creating 12 equal size columns, and then we're going to give those columns 20 pixel spacing. And then later we can say, hey, this video, make sure you fit 3 of those columns, and then apply that to all the videos. And then on a smaller screen, we can say, hey, fit 6 columns or be full width, which would be 12 columns. So you might be curious too, like why 12 columns? Well, one reason 12 columns is nice is it's divisible by 3, by 4, by 6, by 2. It's just a small number that's divisible by several different things, so you can kind of resize things easily. And this is also the 12 column layout, just kind of was really made popular with frameworks like Bootstrap. So it's something just you kind of see a lot of designers using because it's something that we've been using for quite some time now. All right, so now that we did that, you can see in here, if we come over and inspect this and come into the videos, you can see now that it has 12 equally sized grids. Now, because we're not telling the actual video how much to take up, it's just going to take up by default one given area or one like little box. So that's why they're so small right now. So to fix that, we want to go ahead and define the video size. But before we do that, we want to define the grid gap, which is the spacing. So grid gap would be 20 pixels, which is just coming again right from our Figma design. So now you can see those are nice and evenly spaced. And then we can go ahead and target the video. So we'll do video. And the first thing I want to do is set a height here. So we'll do height. We'll do 180 pixels. And you might be wondering, like, Hunter, actually in the Figma design, this isn't 180 pixels, it's actually 155. And this is just something I ended up deciding to make a little bit larger after I designed it. So feel free to still use 155 if you think that looks better. I just thought a little taller looked a little nicer. So that's the reason of why that is not 155. All right, so now that we have that, we can go ahead and say how much we want to, actually how big we want these to be. So to do that, I'm going to use a setting here called grid column start. And what this is going to allow us to do is set something called span. So I can say, hey, I want this video to span 3 columns. So once we save that, you can see now that out of these 8 videos, they all span 3 columns. And we can come back and change this on different screens, which we're going to do with the media queries. But you can see with just a couple things, we were able to style that with just a couple lines there, which is really kind of a testament to why Grid is it's such an incredible tool. Cool. So now we want to set position to relative. And why this is important is that this is going to allow us to use position absolute once we center this font icon. But first we have to set the position relative to its parent container. And the next thing we want to do is go ahead and use the transition. So transition, and that's going to be set to the variable here. So variable ease. And then we can go ahead and set some of the background image settings here. So background size, cover, background position is going to be center, and background repeat is going to be no repeat. And then we can go ahead and do video hover. So on video hover, we want to transform with scale. So we want to scale this up a little bit, and we'll just do the same value that we did above. So 1.02. And let's go ahead and save that. And now once we hover over these, you can see they scale up. And you can see that it's like has a little bit of a, it's not instantaneous. So let's come back and just delete this transition right here. I'm going to save this, and then once we hover over this, you can see how it's like instant. It doesn't really look as nice as when we had that transition. So that just gives you a better idea of why that transition is a really important thing here that we set in our CSS. So once we save that again, you can see that it has that nice smooth motion. All right, so we don't have that much left to do. The next thing we want to do is the icon styling. So we'll do video I. And on here, we want to do cursor pointer as well. So when someone hovers over that, they know that it's something they can click on. And here we want to set position to absolute. And here's where we can actually start to reposition this. And this is just kind of a well-known way of centering something with absolute positioning. And what we want to do first is we want to set left to 50%. So it's going to look at the parent div that it's in, and then it's going to center it 50% to the left. So it's going to do the math for us, and then just move that child element to 50% to the left. So if we save that, you can see how that has now been moved 50% to the left. Now it's a little bit off because it's not taking in consideration of where it's kind of making that choice. And right now it's making that choice off the left edge of this play button. So the left edge of the play button is in the center, but the center of the play button isn't in the center. But we'll fix that here in just a bit. But first, let's go ahead and set top here to 50% as well. So if we save that, you can see now that, again, it's kind of in the center, but the top left edge of this play icon is in the center. So right here is the center. So we need to kind of figure out the size of this and then kind of calculate where this needs to be transformed to. But first, let's go ahead and set the font size right underneath this cursor. So I want to do just font size is going to be 60 pixels. So this is just coming right from our design. So now that it's a little bigger, you can see here a little better once we change some of this transform. And what we need to do is transform and then use translate. And translate allows us to move the X and Y value. And what we want to do is we want to move this to the left 50% of its width, and then up to the top 50% of its height. Now, if you knew the size of this, you could do this a different way, but a faster way is just using the translate, and it's going to allow us to do something like negative 50%. So it's going to do the math for us. So we don't need to know that, and that's helpful because if we didn't know the width and height of this, or if the width and height changed, it's just going to do that for us, and we don't have to figure out the math for every single use case. And the next one is the Y value, so negative 50% as well. And once we save that, we can see now the button is in the true center of its parent div. Cool, so the next thing we want to do is just change this from black to the white. So to do that, we'll do color var light. And the next one, we're going to change the opacity. And this is just a style actually that I decided to add later on. This isn't actually in the Figma design, but I just thought it would be nice to have the opacity a little less than 100%. And then once we hovered over it, it would be 100%. We already set the font size. The next thing is the transition. So let's do transition. We'll do the var, and we'll use the var of ease. All right, so save that so we can see that there. And the next one is the hover pseudo class. So video I hover, and we just want to make that opacity 1 or 100%. So now once we hover over this, you can see that it goes from 85 to 100%, and then that cursor also changes to the pointer. So just it's very clear that this is what you need to click on in order to play the video. All right, so that's basically everything for our default styles. Now we need to jump in and actually set our media queries. Now, if you don't know what media queries are, it's a way to apply different styles based on the size of the screen. So let's say, for instance, this was on mobile. So let's just make this really skinny. I'm not a big fan of this layout, but let's say, for instance, you can keep that, but I'd rather have this image take up the full width and have that apply to all of the video layers. So this is why, or when media queries would be helpful. So the first one we want to do is a media query for something not mobile, but somewhere in between. And that's going to be at media, only screen, and here's where we can actually set the breaking point. So we'll do max width, and that max width will be set to 1200 pixels. So where am I getting 1200 pixels? Well, really where I got it was just looking at this design in the browser and deciding like, hey, when do I want to change the size of this? So let's say, for instance, like right here, I want to change the size. Now keep an eye out up here. It'll actually tell us the size of our browser. So right here, it's at 1280, 1270. But another way you could figure out the width of something is literally just Googling it. So what is my browser size? And then this website here is how big is my browser, will tell you the actual width of your browser. So let's say, for instance, at 1279, you want this styling to be applied. So you can do 1279, but I'm going to do 1200 because it's a nice round number. And then we can change the styles. And what I'm going to change is the video. And what we want to change is how much space this takes up. So we'll do grid, column start. And instead of spanning 3, we'll span 6. So it's going to take up half the space. And now once we resize this down, you'll see how those videos will change. And the next thing I'm going to do is just change the height. So I want these to be a little taller. So let's do 240 pixels. So now you can see those are a little taller. And the next thing I'm going to do is just copy this media query and then paste it below. And on here, I'm going to say like right around 800 pixels. I want it to change to full width. So we can come in here and just say 800. I'm going to get rid of the height value. And because this is 12 columns, in order to make it full width, we need to span all 12 columns. So span 12. And now once it's hit 800, you can see that the video now takes up the full width, which looks really good on smaller screens like mobile. And then once we spread this out, you can see how that is going to look. Cool. And there you go. That's everything as far as the CSS. Now we need to actually bring this home by making sure that these actual, the watch button and these little play buttons actually play the video. And to do that, we're going to be using JavaScript. So with that said, I'll see you in the next video.